So I'm back today with more horror and thriller reviews, and today I'm excited to have another brand new favorite for you all. This is a book by an author who I can now officially call a favorite author because I like to read at least a few books by them that I really enjoy before I officially make the call. And so I'm excited to bring that to you here, as well as some new releases. We have some new books to talk about. Let's get started. Now let's start with the new releases, starting with Piñata by Leopoldo Gout. This is a book that I received for review from Torrid Nightfire. And in the story we follow a woman. She is a mother who is working in Mexico. She usually lives in New York, but she's in Mexico to complete a job. There is a church that she is renovating, and she's there with her two young daughters. And at the beginning of the story we follow them through their life as they are enjoying their time in this country, which is the place of this woman's heritage. And then we follow them later on in the story as they return to New York. Basically, in the story, something happens, something goes terribly wrong at the job site, and she is forced to go back to New York in shame. However, possibly something follows them home, possibly they unearth some artifacts and unsettle the dead. So I love the premise of this one. It's one that plays around with potential possession and all the great things that come along with that. I also really enjoy the cultural aspects of this one. I tend to have a strange sweet spot for Mexican horror, even though it's not my own heritage. I just find that everything I read I tend to love, and that is definitely the case here. Most of all, I was really impressed by the character work in this one. This one is very feminist leaning. It follows a mother and her two young daughters, so there's a lot of female energy in this book, and I really found myself forgetting that it was written by a male author. I find so often readers give a really hard time to males writing women, but over and over again, I find that there are so many talented horror authors that are just as good as writing women as men and really break those stereotypes down. So I really enjoyed this one. It was fierce, it was feminine. It's also just really honest, the portrayal of motherhood. I thought the daughters also rang true as real people. They weren't completely annoying, but they also kind of read like young kids, and I really could see myself in that position. If I had a drawback to this book, it's the fact that it's very slow going at the beginning. The basic premise that I gave to you is all available on the back of the book, but the actual return to New York happens far later in the book than I expected. And instead, you spend a lot more time just hanging out with the characters as they're spending time in Mexico. Again, I enjoyed them going to the markets and coming across this piñata and all of the little aspects and elements to the story. But if you're looking for the action to get started, you're going to have to wait a little bit. But overall, I enjoyed this one. I have a real soft spot also for possession and exorcism stories, so this one was pretty much right up my alley. I was very excited for this one because I love the author's previous work, Ghost Radio, and while I personally do prefer that one, this one is still a solid 4 stars and easily one of the best new releases that I've read so far this year in terms of horror, so I definitely recommend it. If you're a fan of Mexican-inspired horror like I am, this is definitely one you're going to want to check out and hopefully love as much as I did. Next up, we have Gothic. There's another book that I received for review, and this is a book that follows a horror author who is gifted this antique desk in order to help inspire them to write. However, little do they know that this desk has a certain history. It's possibly a haunted or possessed object, or just has some kind of supernatural aspects about it, let's say. And of course the story spirals from there. This is a book that I had to keep checking that it actually was a 2023 release, because while reading it, it read like vintage horror. For some of you watching that, that's going to be a huge plus. If you love the classics, which definitely follow the kind of tropes of the possibly possessed object falling into someone's hand, this book read exactly like one of those old books. Unfortunately, I do have more of a preference for more modern literature when it comes to horror. I will admit I do have my personal tastes coming into play when I do review books. And so I didn't love this one as much as I wished I had, and a lot of it just comes down to the fact that it's extremely tropey. Now, when I read a classic book that follows those tropes, I'm more forgiving because, again, often those books are the ones that created the tropes. But for a book written and or at least published in this present year, I would have expected the book to subvert those tropes or to do something a little bit different. And I just wasn't overall really impressed or excited about the character work or the plotting. This book just felt a little bit too long. Perhaps as a novella, I would have liked it more. And I think a lot of my disappointment really comes from the fact that I've read this author before very recently. This is the same author who wrote The Child Among Strangers, which I recently gushed about, which is the book that was published last year. And so I had high hopes that I would love this one as well. And unfortunately I did not. I definitely appreciate what it's doing. I don't think it's a bad book. I think, again, if you love vintage horror or books written in that vintage style, you may love this one, but it simply wasn't for me. And it's just very drastically different than his other work. So I think if you love that one, you won't necessarily love this one, or vice versa, because had I not known it was the same author, I never would have figured it out. The writing style, the tone and narrative structure of the books just felt incredibly different to me. But overall, glad I got to check it out. Disappointed that it wasn't the favorite I wanted it to be. Next up, we have The Stranger in Our House by Sarah Denzil. This is another new release, and in the story we follow a family who is moving away from the city. They're going off to a remote village. Something goes wrong. Their son disappears, but he returns. However, when he comes back, he is not quite the same. He seems to be a different person, hence the title of this story. I really love the premise of this one. I like this kind of story. I've seen similar narratives before, but I never get tired of them, so I eagerly pick this one up. I've read this author in the past and tend to find them to write very engaging stories. However, I personally was disappointed by this one, not because the story was bad, but the narrative structure was not to my taste. Basically, with this story, it's written in a non-traditional novel style, so instead of being written as a story typically is, instead, it is written through forms of interviews and messages between the characters and letters and all of that. And I know some people love that aspect, these non-traditional narrative style. I personally don't. I would rather read a novel as a novel, and especially the way that I consume books at this point, I find that that style just comes across very fragmented, and I often lose a lot of immersion. So I'd love to know if I'm not the only one who just wants novels to read like novels. So love the idea, didn't love the execution, but I happen to know that tons of people online adore those styles when you're kind of piecing together the story based off of different fragments of information and documents all put together at the end for the reader, but it's not my thing. So if you enjoy that, maybe you'll like this one a little bit more than I did. Now I have to talk about my new favorite book in this video by a new favorite author, and that is Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood. I've been singing this author's praises for a long time, but technically I hadn't read enough of their work that I loved in order to officially call them a favorite. I've said so many times on my channel that in order to keep my Canadian citizenship, I have to talk about Margaret Atwood on a regular basis, so I'm doing that now. And if you don't know, this is a piece of historical fiction, but it reads almost like a historical thriller, and this is one that I would highly recommend to anyone who shares my love of true crime, because while this is a piece of fiction, it is based off of a real crime that took place in the 1800s in Canada surrounding Toronto, where there was a man and his lover who were killed off by two of their servants within their house. The man was convicted and killed, and his partner, Grace, was put on trial, and the question was she a bystander? Was she also being coerced by this man? Or was she a willing participant? Or perhaps did she orchestrate the whole thing? And as you can imagine, this is an interesting book that is basically this character study of this young woman. The author does a lot of research, which is referenced in the back of the book, where you really get to find out the true history as much as it is known, and the parts that were embellished and the parts that were pulled from fact. And it was absolutely fascinating. If you love unreliable narrators as much as I do, I think that you will be enraptured by this book, because essentially the question that is posed to the reader, you have to figure out for yourself, is she telling the truth? She provides a certain narrative within the book, and I came to certain conclusions, but as the narrative shifts and change, because it's a relatively long book, you really have to decide who you believe, how much you believe them, and it makes a lot of really interesting commentary about how we treat women, how they are vilified, and just how society doesn't always treat them very well. And my opinions about Miss Grace went back and forth, and I had all the different feelings of emotions. There were some twists and turns I did not see coming, and it just made for a really compelling story. I was engrossed by this one. I could not stop reading. It's relatively long, but I read it in days. and I just cannot recommend it enough. I loved it a lot. It currently has a 4.5 rating on Goodreads just because I struggled so much to commit to the perfect 5 stars, but I'll probably read it again this year and it might make the perfect 5-star rating once I get a chance to read it from start to finish all over again. But I really have no criticism of this book. I think the prose are beautiful, the character work is amazing, and it's a really compelling story because again, you just want to know what actually happened. And Margaret Atwood kind of gives you ideas, she kind of gives you a conclusion. I don't want to say that this book is left ambiguous because you are left with a possible ending to the story, but because it's based off of real events, of course, even the ending that we are given, we don't necessarily know that it is true. It's just Margaret Atwood's best guess of what might have happened, her interpretation, and you as the reader are certainly free to make your own guesses. So this is the book that after I finished it, I have not stopped thinking about it, and it's been a little bit since I last recorded a video, so I've been dying to talk about this one, and I don't think I'm going to stop thinking about it anytime soon. It's fantastic, and of course I've gone down the rabbit hole to learn as much as I can about the real case because I want to know the truth, and I never will, but I want to know. So if you're like me and just get addicted to true crime stories, this is one you do not want to miss. It's an incredible work of fiction based off of an incredibly sad but compelling case. Next up is The Ghost Bride, which is a horror story that almost leans into fantasy because it is a ghost story that is set in a historical time period in Malaysia where there are Chinese influence. And we follow a young woman who is part of a family that has become down on their luck. They are no longer very wealthy. And so her father goes into an agreement to marry her off to the family that is going to help take care of them. But by doing so, she's not going to be married to a living person, but to a dead spirit. This falls in line with certain cultural beliefs, which are discussed within the story. And of course, our main character is very reluctant to do so. It's very unlucky. It's very sad to be betrothed to someone who is not in the living. And because this is a horror or supernatural story, there is more to it. And so basically, she ends up having experiences and getting to meet this ghost spirit, and the story goes on from there. This book is very character driven. It is relatively slow paced, but at the same time I found it to be incredibly compelling, and I just found the idea of it just to be something that I hadn't quite heard before, and I was very interested to learn how that cultural tradition started, which is discussed further again in the end of the book when you do get a little bit of the backstory to the truth and history of that all. And overall I was very enraptured by it, for lack of a better word. There is a section in the middle that I did find personally a little bit too slow for my taste, but then it picked up again and I was completely hooked back in. And it's just, again, unique. I struggle to find ghost stories that I like, mostly because most ghost stories are actually haunted house stories, which you might know is not my favorite genre. So if you have any recommendations for ghost stories, especially ones that are outside the box and a little bit more unique and different like this one, I would love to know because I really enjoyed this and I kind of want more. And finally, I want to talk about Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. This is almost more of a fantasy story, but I'm going to talk about it here because it was the book choice for my Patreon book club, always linked down below. But for this month, our theme was horror satire, and so this was the book that got nominated, and it's an incredibly hard book for me to even summarize. It is again a satire, so it's more funny than horrifying, and it plays around a lot with the idea of the end of the world, the rapture, and so we follow these angels and demons, and there is an angel who is rather reluctant for the end of the world to come, and the story is just really bizarre. You can probably tell from the way I'm describing this that I tried to like it. I wanted to give it an honest chance, and I did read it through, but I didn't really love it. And it's mostly the fact that I tend to prefer more serious books. I tend to prefer more dark books. And this one was really goofy and bizarre. I've read Neil Gaiman before and really liked some of his work, more so like Coraline and so forth. But I have a feeling that Terry Pratchett, who I've never read before, is probably too goofy for me. So them together just didn't really work. I did do the audiobook, which I definitely think was the best way to do it because I had a full cast narration, and the audiobook as a narrative performance was great, but I just kind of wanted them to perform something else because it was just a little bit too goofy. Maybe if this had been a shorter book, but I tend to find these kind of goofy, fun stories just to be a bit too much. I kind of get tired of that like sickly sweet funniness and want something a little bit more dark and depressing. So this just wasn't entirely up my alley. I picked it up because of the book club, which is great. I always love trying something new, something different, and having friends to discuss it with. But is it an all-time favorite? Will it end up on my favorites list at the end of the year? No. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know, of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd also love to know who is a new favorite author of yours, or what criteria do you use when you're deciding to call someone a new favorite? So for me, typically I say that I have to read at least 3 books by them that I love, and not just books in the same series. And that's usually what I need to do before I'm officially wanting to call someone a favorite, and that's finally happened with Margaret Atwood. I love Alias Grace as well as The Handmaid's Tale and The Edible Woman. But today, if you are new to my channel and want to subscribe, I do read a lot of horror thrillers as well as science fiction fantasy. If you want to help me out, you can give me a thumbs up, share this video around online, drop a comment, even if it's just a, I want to say an Alias Grace, but I don't know what that emoticon looks like. I don't know. Find something creative. Surprise me. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.